No one understands Super Mario Galaxy 3. Not really, because what makes a Super Mario Galaxy 3 possible or impossible is buried in obscure interviews, half-forgotten development decisions, and subtle shifts in Nintendo's creative philosophy. Even after all this research, there's still lots that I don't know. This is a deep dive into what actually happened behind the scenes, what it means, and why the odds of Super Mario Galaxy 3 might look very different once we lay all the pieces out. I'm going to walk you through 3 specific surprising claims. They're each going to challenge your assumptions about how Nintendo makes decisions, and they're each going to shift your perspective on Super Mario Galaxy 3. Claim number 1 is that Super Mario Galaxy 2 wasn't the plan, and this has interesting repercussions for a potential Super Mario Galaxy 3. Claim number 2, more speculative, is that if not for Miyamoto, it's quite possible that we would not have gotten Donkey Kong Bonanza in the Switch 2 showcase, but the brand new 3D Mario game instead. Claim number 3 is that Super Mario Galaxy 3 is not likely, but it is less unlikely on Switch 2 than it has been on any previous Nintendo console. Check out the poll about that in the comments section. I think this is the most fascinating video that I've made on any topic. By the end, you won't look at Super Mario Galaxy 3 in the same way ever again. So here's the first piece of the puzzle. Have you ever wondered why we don't get lots of 3D Mario remasters in the same way that we get lots of 3D Zelda remasters? There may be several reasons, but one very likely cause is Miyamoto himself. He said in a 2017 interview, "I don't really feel like I want to remake any of them. It's more natural to always create new mechanics and new games." Miyamoto's unique perspective on remaking 3D Mario games is something we can see manifested in the way that 3D Mario games do get brought back. For example, Super Mario 64 DS arguably wasn't really just a remake, it was a reimagining, with lots of new levels and playable characters. You don't even start the game as Mario anymore, and all this is done with the specific intention of crafting a cutting-edge experience that really shows off the new DS hardware, or what was the new DS hardware. And when they brought Super Mario 3D World to Switch, the core game itself stayed pretty intact, and they mainly focused on pushing the envelope of Mario with an entirely new experience known as Bowser's Fury, which might very well end up serving as a prototype/template for the next 3D Mario game. While we do need to be careful not to put too much emphasis on this Miyamoto quote, especially as he is getting increasingly less involved with the Mario series anyway, and it's also not clear whether he was talking about the past or simply what he was going to do moving forward. But I do think that overall, this quote does demonstrate the way in which Miyamoto puts a very high value on new experiences, as opposed to just iterating on old ones, and perhaps to an extent that could be considered high even by Nintendo standards. But that said, I don't think this means that Miyamoto is against doing sequels for 3D Mario games. Here's what one developer said in a Super Mario Galaxy 2 interview with Satoru Iwata. He said, "Well, actually, just after we made the first Super Mario Galaxy, Miyamoto-san suggested making another one, since we had put so much effort into making an engine that could serve as a good foundation for another game. Everyone had lots of positive stuff to say, like, we did this alright, but it could have been better if we'd done it a little more like so. So, I took those responses and consulted Miyamoto-san about this project, and he just said, why not just make Galaxy 1.5? And then Iwata adds, the idea was to make a new game by simply making use of the spherical landforms from the first game and adding new elements. I heard about that from Miyamoto-san." In a different Iwata Asks interview, Miyamoto said, "We began with the intention of making a game labelled 1.5, but the development staff members were saying things like, it would be fun if we had more environments like this, and let's put in more new stuff. It was like, more, and new environments started multiplying rapidly. The next thing I knew, more than 90% of the courses were new, and I couldn't tell where we'd kept something from the previous game. And so then, as Iwata observes, so in the end, it became 2 rather than 1.5. Now this is really interesting. The interviewees indicated that Super Mario Galaxy 2 was intended to be to Mario what Majora's Mask is to Zelda, a quick asset reusing sequel, so that all the hard work from the first game doesn't go to waste. Because the development team's efforts started to focus on what they could improve from the previous game, Miyamoto suggested that this new Galaxy game be a Mario Galaxy 1.5, which is basically the most literal interpretation possible of the phrase asset reusing sequel that improves on the original. In fact, even Majora's Mask was originally conceptualized as a 1.5 game rather than as a full-blown sequel. So it's important that we understand what caused Super Mario Galaxy 2 to exist, so then we can assess whether those same conditions could cause a Super Mario Galaxy 3 to exist in the future. So on that note, we are faced with a bit of ambiguity in these interviews. So when Miyamoto first proposed doing another Galaxy game, was he already thinking of something as big and standalone as Super Mario Galaxy 2? If so, that means his later reference to Galaxy 1.5 was actually a backpedal, a scaled down pivot away from doing a full-blown sequel. And in that case, Galaxy 2 was the original idea all along, which would suggest that Galaxy sequels as an idea are intentional. And if Galaxy 2 happened from Miyamoto saying, yeah, let's do Super Mario Galaxy 2, then that makes the idea of Galaxy 3 seem more plausible. Maybe all it would take is for Miyamoto or for someone else at Nintendo to say, yeah, let's do Super Mario Galaxy 3, and that would be that, and Galaxy 3 would start development. Whether anyone at Nintendo would say that is something that we'll get to in a bit. But there's another possibility. Maybe Miyamoto wasn't thinking about a full-blown sequel at all when he first brought up the idea. Maybe he just meant something quick and asset reusing, the nature of which we will determine later after we've had a nice little brainstorming session. This could mean that when he first mentioned Galaxy 1.5, then that was the first specific suggestion that he had floated about the game. And if that's the case, then that's even more interesting, because that means that Galaxy 2 was not the original plan, but instead just what their Galaxy 1.5 project evolved into. Or in other words, Super Mario Galaxy 2 kinda just happened. And if that's the case, then that doesn't bode well for Super Mario Galaxy 3 now, does it? I mean, are we just supposed to sit around and wait for Super Mario Galaxy 3 to kinda just happen? Of course, just because one sequel emerged a certain way, it doesn't mean the next one has to follow the same path. Nintendo could still decide, deliberately and proactively, to make Super Mario Galaxy 3. But the question is, why would they? If they weren't even that hot on the idea of making a Galaxy 2 back in the day, why would they feel so hot about making a Galaxy 3 nowadays? If anything, you would think it would be the other way round, and that they would be hot on the idea of a second game, but not so hot on the idea of a third game. Super Mario Galaxy 2 was birthed from wanting to make the most out of the engine that they had made for Galaxy 1, but in 2025, that motivation no longer exists. They no longer have any need to make the most out of the Galaxy engine, and so, well, why go back and create another Galaxy game? Well, I'm glad you asked. Of course, I don't mean from the customer's perspective. We are just a bunch of filthy, unintelligent heathens who demand sequels to everything and want Count Bleck to be a playable character in Mario Kart 11. But from Nintendo's perspective, well, here's one interesting nugget from Iwata asks. So, for context, they're mulling over how it is that they managed to come up with so many different ideas for Super Mario Galaxy 2. In Iwata, he says, well, no one else is trying to base a game around spherical landforms and gravity shifts, close quote. And of course, so what that basically means is anything the devs can think of relating to the idea of these spheres and gravity shifts is therefore new, because no other developer has tried anything like it. And even 20 years later, I still don't think that Mario Galaxy has much competition in terms of its mechanics, and therefore it makes a great foundation still on which to make new games, packed to the brim with new ideas. Iwata said, Miyamoto-san said that the spheres were an incredibly interesting and appealing basis for a game, and that they solved a lot of problems that he had been pondering over for a long time. One such problem, it seems, is the problem of difficulty. It seems a lot of people are saying things like, unlike 2D Mario, I get lost in 3D Mario, and 3D Mario is more difficult than 2D Mario, so I can't do it. And I had a feeling that you were determined to do something about that sometime, says Iwata. And Miyamoto replies, yes, but I think that we had solved a lot of the problems inherent in 3D Mario games with the first Mario Galaxy. You play on spheres, so if you run around them, you will always return to where you started. Miyamoto has a bit of a history with wanting games to be easier. For example, he said he regretted making Super Mario Sunshine so difficult, as it should be something that even Grandma and Grandpa should be able to pick up and play. Another time, he said, I want to make a game where 80 to 90% of customers can make it to the end, even if that means we have to risk that players who make it lose some of that feeling of challenge or achievement. So, perhaps a reason to go back to the Galaxy formula is because spherical landforms work so well in making 3D Mario games accessible. This links really well with what Miyamoto also said in a different interview in 2015 with Eurogamer. Prepare yourselves. He says, a new Mario Galaxy is always in discussion, but even with Super Mario 64, there was a lot of feedback about motion sickness with the 3D, or maybe us making it too difficult. When discussing the problem of whether to do a 3D action title or challenge Galaxy instead, Miyamoto also mentioned the idea of a game that straddles a middle ground between the two, that can be enjoyed by everyone. 3D World straddles that middle ground, probably slightly closer to the linear end of the spectrum, and now we've also got Bowser's Fury, which is probably slightly closer to the open world end of the spectrum. With the way that it blends open world and linear elements together, it is speculated by many to be the template for the next 3D Mario game. So why work on a new Galaxy game nowadays? Well, to take advantage of the Bowser's Fury formula and unlock Galaxy's full potential as a game that anybody can play, because the player will have more flexibility as to which stars they attempt and in what order. I know the original Mario Galaxy had a bit of that freedom, but not quite to the same extent. I'm also thinking about something like Super Mario Bros. Wonder, where it had different levels with their own difficulty star ratings, and this meant that you could try the levels you wanted to play based on their difficulty, or in other words, you choose your own difficulty. And the idea of selective difficulty works really well with a guitar analogy that a certain Nintendo employee is going to mention in a minute. Of course, Bowser's Fury did have some considerable performance issues, especially when Fury Bowser was away, and we might imagine that a Bowser's Fury style Galaxy game could be even more demanding due to all the different levels and areas that might be loaded in at once, perhaps. However, given how souped up the Switch 2 is looking to be, then I suspect it could probably handle a game like that pretty well. I mean, if Elden Ring's on there, you know. By the way, if you're finding this video informative, why not leave a like? So, reading the Iwata Asked interviews, you really get the vibes that Miyamoto wasn't completely satisfied with Super Mario Galaxy 1. A deeply fascinating concept he mentions is the idea of resonance, which he uses in a very deep way that's hard to define, but, to summarise, seems to relate to the idea of you've reasoned things out for yourself and put them to the test. Things kind of make a logical sense, and they strike home with you. Resonance needs to be balanced with the unfamiliar in a game, so that the game connects with you when you first pick it up, but then you get gradually drawn in by the unfamiliar to delve deeper and deeper into the game. While developing Super Mario Galaxy 2, Miyamoto and Koizumi had a nice long chat. Since Super Mario Sunshine, Miyamoto had felt that there was something not quite natural about the way that story was being put into Mario games, and so he'd pushed for that kind of thing to be cut out of future releases. And so, when Koizumi snuck Rosalina's storybook into Galaxy regardless, Miyamoto wasn't happy. So Koizumi came out of this discussion with a new perspective on Mario. He says, if someone hands you a Mario game, you can play all kinds of different ways, but a first-time player will just walk around and maybe jump once. That is like playing a single string on a guitar. Then, when you get a little better, you do a wall jump, like playing two strings. You play the same song over and over again, and you get better and better, and in the end, you can use all 6 strings and have more and more fun. I think that's like Mario. Our job is to make a song that you enjoy as you improve. Some people may feel like Super Mario Galaxy 2 looks like it's more difficult than New Super Mario Bros. Wii, but the essence is the same, the musical instrument that is Mario. So while there may be several more strings, if you play until your hands become accustomed to it, you will be able to play the way you want. The objective of a Mario game is reaching the goal, and each course is, in musical terms, like 1 or 2 measures. This game made me realise for the first time that the way we make Mario games is to leave it up to the players how they want to arrange and play their music on their way to the goal. Aside from actions involving items, the character of Mario can basically do whatever he wants from the very start. Link, in the Legend of Zelda games, gathers items one by one to power up, but Mario, he starts off being able to do everything. That's just like a musical instrument. A musical instrument can play any kind of complicated music from the very beginning, but you engage with it at your own pace, and then you gradually improve. The value of the experience lies in the player's hands. I realised that our objective isn't telling a story, it's making a tool. The consequences of this discussion are manifested in the Final Galaxy 2 game, which has much less story elements, but is generally considered to have more fun and varied gameplay, and this is an opinion shared by Miyamoto himself. Iwata says, "Something that really struck me this time was that while it goes without saying that Miyamoto-san's games are always fun, Miyamoto-san went out of his way to tell me that this time the game is really fun." And so after Iwata said that, everyone else who was in the room for the interview, they were like, "Wow, really? He said that? He never says that." I thought that was quite funny, actually. And then Iwata continues, "The fact that he told me that must mean that it really struck a chord with him. I think it's the high concentration of ideas that made him say it." Koizumi adds, "Maybe he feels like we took care of some of his own homework left over from last time." Iwata agrees. "It seems to have lightened him incredibly to have had that heart-to-heart with you and cleared up problems that had gone unaddressed for 10 years. So what I'm getting at here is that Miyamoto is beyond pleased with Super Mario Galaxy 2 in a way that he just wasn't with the first game. He doesn't seem to have any unresolved emotional baggage or regrets. Does that bode poorly for the chances of a third game? Well, in the 2015 Eurogamer interview, Miyamoto said, "Me and Yoshiaki Koizumi-san, director of Galaxy and later producer of 3D World and Odyssey, are always looking to challenge Galaxy and do another 3D action title." And I should note here, when he says challenge Galaxy and do another 3D action title, he is talking about 2 separate options, given that Galaxy is more linear than some of Mario's more sandboxy 3D action titles like 64 and Sunshine. I think he's saying, I want to make a 3D Mario game that returns to being sandboxy, but on the other hand, I want to make a linear 3D game that tries to steal the crown from Galaxy 2. And I think his wording is key here. Challenge Galaxy. That could mean many things, but it doesn't necessarily mean another Galaxy game. If he sees Galaxy 2 as this magnum opus that's basically perfect, then perhaps his idea of challenging Galaxy is to make a stylistically new 3D game that reaches the same highs of Galaxy 2 rather than just doing more Mario Galaxy. He continues, "However, we can't make so many games at once in parallel, but as the hardware technology gets better and advances, I think there will be lots of opportunity for both options." Now this is really interesting because with Switch 2, we now have much more powerful hardware and many more games being developed in parallel. Could it be that these conditions will give birth to this game that Miyamoto has considered making for so long? We also need to consider that the beginning of the Switch generation had very different circumstances to now. Back then, Nintendo had a big issue with playing things too safe and generic, and so it makes sense that their solution would be to make a 3D action game like Odyssey, which was specifically crafted with the intention of going against the grain and surprising people, even down to things such as the colour of the desert sand. Whereas now, the Mario series is riding a surge of creativity and wonder, so it's not like people would look at a Super Mario Galaxy 3 and exclaim that it's too similar to everything else that's been coming out lately. Plus, we've seen a lot more recently of Nintendo leveraging nostalgia and fan service. One of the many factors contributing to the Wii U's failure is the disconnect that seemed to often exist between what Nintendo thought its customers wanted and what they actually wanted, and this is clearly demonstrated by many of its abysmal traditional marketing campaigns. But in the Switch generation, it's actually been kinda scary how much they've known exactly what we've wanted and delivered it like a targeted precision strike. I'd say Thousand Year Door HD is the prime example of this, but I'm sure you can think of plenty of others. Dreams have come true this generation, and now with GameCube on NSO and Kirby Air Riders announced, it almost feels like they're running out of old things to bring back. Not because they actually are, but just because of how much they've done so far in just the Switch generation alone. 3D Mario doesn't normally do direct sequels like Galaxy 2, because it's always trying to reinvent itself with each new console generation, and frankly, that's one of the reasons why 3D Mario is one of Nintendo's highest rated series after 3D Zelda and 3D Metroid. I'm noticing a bit of a pattern here. It looked like there was going to be extra pressure on the Switch 2 3D Mario, with many people speculating that it was going to be to the Switch 2 what Breath of the Wild was to Switch 1. But then, based on 5-year-old rumours, and also our eyes, it looks like Super Mario Odyssey 2, if it ever existed, has somehow ended up evolving into Donkey Kong Bonanza. I wouldn't even be surprised if this is one of those examples of Miyamoto upending the tea table. For those who don't know, Miyamoto has a bit of a reputation for looking at a game halfway through development, not liking what he sees, and mandating specific alterations that completely change the entire game, and significantly lengthening the game's development cycle. Paper Mario Sticker Star is probably one of the most famous examples of this, but another very relevant case is that of Dinosaur Planet, where Miyamoto noticed the similarities between Dinosaur Planet and Star Fox, and so got the developers to convert Dinosaur Planet into what ended up being a Star Fox game like no one had ever seen before, called Star Fox Adventures. Sure, Miyamoto did say in an interview that upending the tea table isn't something he does anymore as he gets more and more distanced from game development, but I'd say this is clarified in a different quote by an IGN writer. He says, "When I spoke to fellow longtime Nintendo creative Shinya Takahashi in 2019, he gave the impression that, at the time, Miyamoto's role largely involved passing judgment on new prototypes. He's not involved in the minute details of development, but does oversee entire projects and identifies major issues. This part is bad, this part is bad, this part is bad." So in other words, I wouldn't be surprised if we hear in interviews in a few months' time that when the Odyssey devs started work on a successor, that Miyamoto came in and suggested, "Hey, how about you make a Donkey Kong the main character?" I mean, this is just speculation, but I suspect Miyamoto had been wanting for quite a while to make Donkey Kong his own again, after loaning Mr. Kong out to Western studios for several decades. And so, yeah, superimposing Donkey Kong onto Odyssey 2 is a very believable way that Miyamoto might have tried to make Donkey Kong his own again. And in terms of timing, it does line up very well with the redesign that Donkey Kong got for Miyamoto's Super Mario Bros. Movie. Or even if the impetus for Bonanza didn't come from Miyamoto, the game was probably still a sudden mandate from somewhere at the top of the Nintendo pecking order as part of Nintendo's big push for the DK brand, and this might have caused whatever new game the team was already working on before to be pushed to the side. But either way, now that we have Donkey Kong Bonanza, do you realise what this means? To an extent, Donkey Kong Bonanza has filled the spot that 3D Mario would have taken, the fresh, cartoony, system-selling, open-world 3D platformer. And so that means that the next 3D Mario game is now off the hook to a degree. It has a bit more wiggle room to be whatever it wants to be, free from the very heavy demands of being a launch window title. Of course, it'll still have lots of pressure just from being a 3D Mario game. After all, some people won't buy Donkey Kong Bonanza as it doesn't have Mario in the title, which means that DK Bonanza and the new 3D Mario game aren't perfectly interchangeable. Plus, with all the discourse raging about whether the Switch 2 is financially worth it, Nintendo really needs their tentpole franchises like 3D Mario to be especially well received. What if the entire Odyssey team is now tied up with Donkey Kong Bonanza? That means the next 3D Mario game might be made by a different team, maybe a B team with less experience, and if that's the case, it's easier to imagine them returning to a proven framework like Galaxy, rather than reinventing everything again from scratch. Now, it's hard to know how Nintendo splits its internal teams. They're famously cagey about it. It's just as possible that the Odyssey team expanded and has been working on two major 3D platformers at once. And with good reason. Nintendo's workforce has grown by 53% over the last 11 years, nearly 3,000 extra employees. Some of that is just the rising demands of HD and 4K development, but but it could also mean that they're now able to develop more ambitious games in parallel. With the Super Mario Bros. Movie coming spring 2026, the months leading up to then seem like the perfect period to release a blockbuster 3D Mario. We saw how the previous Mario movie caused a massive uptick in sales for both Mario games and the Switch consoles in general, and no doubt Nintendo is going to be even more keen to take better advantage of these cross-media opportunities this time around. The tease of Yoshi in the end credit scene for the first film could suggest that the sequel will be based on Super Mario World, but that does also seem pretty safe and not all that distinct from the first film. I mean, it could quite easily just end up as another Bowser kidnaps Peach plotline. Plus, a major aspect of Super Mario World is the Koopalings, and well, they seem to be conspicuously absent from the roster of Mario Kart World, assuming they don't get added as free DLC. But you know what other game Yoshi appears in? Super Mario Galaxy 2. A Mario movie based on the Galaxy games is quite plausible to happen at some point, considering the game's massive popularity, and Rosalina's backstory making for some excellent tear-jerking material, assuming Miyamoto doesn't leave it out of the movies like he wanted it to be left out of the games. In fact, I would say that a Super Mario Galaxy movie is probably the Mario equivalent of adapting Sonic Adventure 2 in terms of fan hype and marketing possibilities. And let's not forget the fact that in the first Mario movie, there was literally a Luma. Sure, it could mean nothing, as he was just there for comic relief, or it could be a hint of where their sights are for the next film, a cosmic breadcrumb, if you will. The official distributor for the sequel described the film as sci-fi. I mean, we'll probably find out this year, so we won't have long to wait. The film will definitely be a great boost for Switch 2, helping to keep it further away from the Wii U or 3DS style failure that many people keep predicting. But you can actually debunk all these prophecies of doom with a single word, which is